Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The startup gala was the kind of event I used to thrive on. A swirl of sharp suits, champagne flutes, and the buzz of ambition. As a venture capitalist, my job often felt like playing chess in the dark, guessing which pawns might turn into queens. But tonight, I wasn't just there to scout for the next big thing. I was there with Jenna, my wife, the one constant in my unpredictable world. She stood out as she always did. Jenna had a way of commanding attention without trying. Her auburn hair catching the soft glow of the chandeliers. Her emerald green dress clinging to her figure in a way that made heads turn. She was my anchor in these high-stakes gatherings. Her presence a reminder of why I worked so hard. "You've outdone yourself," she said as she slipped her arm through mine, her lips brushing my cheek. "This is impressive, even for you." Her praise warmed me, though I brushed it off with a modest shrug. "It's not about the venue," I replied. "It's about finding the right talent." As the evening unfolded, I mingled with familiar faces and new ones alike, shaking hands and trading anecdotes. Jenna stayed by my side for a while, her laughter a soft undercurrent to the hum of conversations. Then she wandered off, caught up in a discussion about design trends with one of the other attendees. I was used to it. She had a natural curiosity that drew people in. It wasn't until later in the evening that I noticed him. Standing near the bar, he was hard to miss. Younger than most of the crowd, with a confidence that bordered on cocky. His name tag read Elliot Grayson, the founder of Brightspark, a promising tech startup I'd recently decided to fund. I'd only met him briefly before, during the pitch meeting, but he'd left an impression. Charismatic, ambitious, and razor-sharp, the kind of entrepreneur who could talk you into believing in anything. Jenna was with him. At first, it seemed innocuous. They were laughing, their heads tilted close together as though sharing a secret. Jenna's hand rested lightly on her cocktail glass, her expression animated in a way I hadn't seen in a while. I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, jealousy, maybe, or simply curiosity. As I approached, their conversation paused. Jenna turned to me, her smile warm but slightly flustered. "David, this is Elliot," she said, gesturing toward him. "We were just talking about his vision for Brightspark. It's fascinating." Elliot extended his hand, his grip firm and self-assured. "Mr. Wakefield," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Thank you for believing in us. Your support means everything." "Call me David," I replied, releasing his hand. "You've got a solid idea. Just make sure you don't waste the opportunity." He laughed, the kind of easy, unforced sound that made people lean in. "I wouldn't dream of it. But honestly, I think the real talent here is Jenna. She was just explaining her approach to design, and I'm blown away." I glanced at Jenna, who flushed under his praise. "Don't listen to him," she said, waving a hand. "He's just flattering me." "Not at all," Elliot insisted. "It's rare to meet someone who sees the world through such a creative lens. You're lucky, David." The words landed somewhere between genuine and overly familiar, but I let it slide. The gala wasn't the place to unpack my unease, and besides, I trusted Jenna. She'd always been loyal, her integrity one of the many things I admired about her. Still, as the night wore on, I couldn't help but notice how often their paths crossed. They lingered by the bar, laughing over some shared joke. They stood side by side during the keynote speech, their shoulders almost touching. Each time I saw them together, the flicker of unease grew stronger. By the time we left the gala, it had settled into a dull ache I couldn't quite shake. "Elliot seems enthusiastic," I said casually as we drove home. Jenna laughed, a soft, melodic sound. "He's just passionate about his work," she replied. "You know how these startup types are. Everything's high energy and big ideas." "And you?" I asked, glancing at her. "What did you think of him?" She hesitated, just for a moment before answering. "He's impressive, bright, driven. I can see why you invested in him." Her words were innocuous enough, but the pause lingered in my mind. That night, as Jenna slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The gala had been a success, Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something subtle but significant. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had no reason to doubt her. And yet, the seed of doubt had been planted. The weeks that followed the gala were a whirlwind of meetings and deal closing, leaving little time to dwell on the unease that had lingered in the back of my mind. Brightspark's trajectory was a priority. Elliot had the kind of momentum that made me believe the investment would pay off tenfold. I buried myself in work, trusting that Jenna's involvement with him was nothing more than a fleeting interaction at a party. Still, subtle changes began to emerge. Jenna had always been spirited and curious, but lately, she seemed restless. She'd take her laptop to the kitchen instead of working in her usual nook by the window. Her phone seemed to be constantly buzzing, drawing her attention away with frequent notifications. When I asked, she'd wave it off. "Just clients," she'd say. But the way she tilted her screen away from me didn't go unnoticed. One evening, I came home earlier than usual, carrying takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. The house was quiet except for the faint murmur of her voice coming from the office. I lingered in the hallway, her laughter trickling through the door, followed by a soft, familiar name, Elliot. I stepped inside, forcing my tone to remain light. "Talking business?" Jenna looked up, startled. Her cheeks flushed as she quickly ended the call. "Yes, sorry, I didn't hear you come in." Her explanation was plausible enough. After all, she was a freelance designer, and collaborations were part of her work. But the way she fidgeted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, made me wonder if there was more to the story. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting the takeout bags on the desk. She nodded, her smile just a shade too bright. "Of course. Thanks for dinner." Over the meal, I tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on Jenna's updates about her projects. But her laughter seemed forced. Her words hurried as though she wanted to steer the conversation away from Elliot's name slipping out. I didn't press. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, and I wasn't about to crack it over a hunch. Yet the days that followed brought more signs I couldn't ignore. Small moments, like catching her typing furiously on her phone and smiling faintly at the screen. Or the way she started dressing more deliberately. Subtle changes, like wearing a shade of lipstick she hadn't touched in years or spritzing on perfume for her client meetings. One afternoon, while Jenna was out, I was organizing the stack of mail on the counter when I noticed an envelope with Elliot's name scrawled in bold letters. Curiosity got the better of me and I opened it. Inside was a handwritten thank you note on Brightspark stationery. * Jenna, thank you for your creative genius. The campaign wouldn't be the same without your touch. Let's grab coffee soon to discuss next steps. Your input is invaluable. Warmly, Elliot *. My stomach tightened. It was innocuous enough, but the familiarity in his tone sent a spark of irritation through me. I told myself it was normal for clients to show appreciation. Jenna was talented, and her work deserved recognition. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that his words hinted at something deeper. That evening, as we prepared dinner together, I brought it up casually. I saw a note from Elliot in the mail. Nice of him to write. Jenna's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before she resumed chopping vegetables. He's just grateful for the work I've been doing on his branding. It's no big deal. He's lucky to have you on board, I said, watching her closely. She didn't meet my gaze. It's just a job, David. Her words were meant to reassure me, but they had the opposite effect. That night, as I lay in bed, Jenna's soft breathing beside me, my mind spun with possibilities. I replayed the gala in my head, the way Elliot's attention had lingered on her, the ease with which she'd engaged him. I reminded myself of her loyalty, her honesty, and yet, doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. A week later, Jenna announced she had a meeting downtown with a client. She was vague about the details, but I didn't push. Instead, I decided to surprise her, dropping by her favorite coffee shop after my own meeting wrapped up earlier than expected. When I walked in, my eyes immediately landed on them. Jenna and Elliot sat in a corner booth, their heads bent close together, laughter dancing between them. She looked radiant, her cheeks flushed, her hand resting lightly on the table, mere inches from his. It wasn't the posture of two people merely discussing business. For a moment I froze, the scene before me a punch to the gut. Then Jenna's gaze lifted, meeting mine. Her smile faltered, her expression shifting to something between guilt and surprise. "David," she said, her voice tinged with a nervous edge. "What are you doing here?" Elliot turned, offering me his trademark confident smile. "David, join us. We were just discussing the next phase of the campaign." I forced a smile, though my heart was pounding. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I'll let you get back to it." Jenna's eyes searched mine, as though trying to gauge what I was thinking. I left without another word, my mind racing. The first cracks in the foundation of our marriage had appeared, and I wasn't sure how to stop them from spreading. The days following my unexpected encounter at the coffee shop passed in a haze of unease. Jenna seemed to sense my withdrawal but attributed it to work stress. She didn't press, and I didn't volunteer anything. I told myself I needed proof before I confronted her. Real, undeniable proof. Without it, any accusations would feel like shadows chasing shadows. That proof came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday, the kind of lazy morning we used to cherish. Jenna had claimed she needed a day out for inspiration, a chance to escape the confines of the house and explore new ideas for a branding project. I didn't object. Instead, I waited until she left, then followed her. I told myself I wasn't being paranoid. I was just being cautious. I'd seen too many friends blindsided by betrayal, too many lives unraveled by secrets kept too long. If there was something to uncover, I needed to know. Jenna drove downtown, her car weaving through the familiar streets until she pulled into the lot of a boutique hotel. My pulse quickened as I parked a safe distance away, watching her enter through the glass doors. 10 minutes later, Elliot arrived. He stepped out of his car with his usual swagger, dressed casually but deliberately, dark jeans, a tailored jacket, and that ever-present air of confidence. My jaw tightened as I watched him enter the hotel, the image of their laughter at the coffee shop flashing through my mind. I waited another few minutes before following. The lobby was quiet, the kind of understated elegance that catered to professionals looking for discretion. I scanned the room, my heart pounding, until I spotted them in the hotel's bar. They were seated in a corner booth, their heads bent close together as if the world outside didn't exist. The scene was maddeningly intimate. Jenna's hand rested on the table, her fingers brushing against Elliot's as they shared a quiet laugh. He leaned in, saying something that made her cheeks flush, her lips curling into a smile I hadn't seen in months. It wasn't just the way they looked at each other. It was the way Jenna's entire demeanor softened in his presence, as if she'd found a version of herself I no longer knew. I wanted to storm over, to demand an explanation, to shatter the bubble of their closeness. But something held me back. Pride, maybe, or the fear of what I might hear. Instead, I retreated to a secluded corner of the bar, ordering a drink I didn't want and pretending to read the menu while my mind raced. They stayed there for over an hour, their conversation punctuated by shared laughter and lingering touches. When they finally stood to leave, I followed at a distance, my breath hitching as they walked toward the elevators. Jenna glanced around, as if checking for prying eyes, before stepping inside with Elliot. The doors closed, sealing them away. My grip tightened around the glass in my hand, the weight of the moment crashing over me. There it was, the confirmation I hadn't wanted but couldn't ignore. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a coincidence. Jenna was betraying me. I stayed at the bar, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours, each second marked by the pounding of my heart. When Jenna finally emerged, her expression was unreadable, but her movements carried a sense of purpose, as though she'd crossed some invisible line she couldn't return from. She left the hotel without noticing me, her car disappearing into the stream of traffic. Elliot followed soon after, his stride as confident as ever, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I watched him leave, my thoughts spiraling into a chaotic mix of anger, humiliation, and heartbreak. For all his charm and ambition, he was nothing more than a thief, stealing something that wasn't his to take. That evening, Jenna returned home as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, her voice light as she recounted her day of supposed inspiration. I played along, nodding at the right moments, my anger simmering beneath the surface. "Sounds like you had a productive day," I said, my tone deliberately even. "I did," she replied, her smile warm but fleeting. "It's good to get out and recharge sometimes." Her words felt like a dagger, twisting deeper with each syllable. I wanted to confront her, to lay it all out and demand the truth. But I needed more. I needed her to admit it, to strip away the lies and face what she'd done. That night, as Jenna slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. The first crack in our marriage had widened into a chasm, and I was standing at the edge, unsure of what lay on the other side. But one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on, even if it meant tearing our world apart. The morning after her day of inspiration, Jenna's demeanor was as cheerful as ever. She flitted around the kitchen, pouring coffee and humming a tune I didn't recognize. It was a masterful performance, too masterful, perhaps. Every smile, every casual touch felt calculated, as though she were overcompensating for the guilt that surely must weigh on her. For my part, I played the role of the unsuspecting husband. I asked about her plans for the day, kissed her on the forehead before I left for the office, and promised to pick up takeout on my way home. But inside, a storm was brewing. I was done ignoring the signs. It was time to dig deeper. Over the next week, I began to piece together their movements. Jenna's phone habits had changed, her screen lighting up with texts and notifications that she dismissed quickly. Her freelance schedule became curiously flexible, with sudden meetings that she never used to have. I tracked her calendar, noting when she claimed to be meeting clients, and compared it to the hotel receipt I'd found crumpled in her purse. Each discrepancy added fuel to the fire. But it was the photos on her laptop that broke me. Jenna had left her computer open one afternoon while she was in the shower. I told myself I wouldn't look, that I'd give her the benefit of the doubt. But my resolve crumbled under the weight of my suspicions. Her email was open, a string of messages between her and Elliot staring back at me. They started innocently enough, discussions about branding concepts, design revisions, but quickly shifted into something else. "Can't stop thinking about you last night. You're incredible, Jenna. I don't know how I'm supposed to focus on anything else." The messages painted a vivid picture, one I wished I could unsee. Worse still were the photos attached, selfies of them together, their smiles intimate and easy, their surroundings unmistakably private. One was in his office, Jenna perched on the edge of his desk, her legs crossed in a way that made my stomach twist. Another was in a hotel room, the sheets rumpled behind them as they grinned at the camera. The final photo was the most damning. Elliot, shirtless, his arm wrapped around her bare shoulders. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. She wasn't just straying. She was fully immersed in a world with him, one that excluded me entirely. That evening, Jenna claimed she had another late meeting. I let her go, my expression carefully neutral, and waited until she left before following her. This time, there was no ambiguity. She drove straight to his apartment, parking in a spot reserved for guests. My pulse pounded as I watched her enter, my mind a blur of rage and heartbreak. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the building, imagining what was happening inside. My thoughts swung wildly between confronting them and walking away forever. But neither option seemed to fit. Instead, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to move, as if witnessing this betrayal was a punishment I deserved for being blind to it for so long. When she finally emerged hours later, her hair slightly disheveled and her expression distant, I felt an ache that was almost physical. She didn't notice my car as she drove off, her taillights disappearing into the night. I waited a few minutes before stepping out and walking to the front door of the building. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but I needed something. The doorman eyed me warily as I approached. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked. "I'm here to see Elliot Grayson," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. The doorman hesitated but eventually nodded. "Apartment 14C, he said. "You'll need to be buzzed in." I thanked him and stepped back outside, staring up at the building. 14C. The number etched itself into my mind, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. I didn't press the buzzer. Not yet. Instead, I returned to my car, the tension in my chest unbearable. I needed a plan. A confrontation was inevitable, but it had to be on my terms. When I got home, Jenna was already in bed, her breathing slow and even. I stood in the doorway, watching her, torn between anger and sorrow. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd loved for over a decade become a stranger, someone capable of such betrayal? I slid into bed beside her, careful not to wake her, and stared at the ceiling. My mind replayed the images, the messages, the moments I'd pieced together. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the realization that she'd chosen someone else over me. Whatever the case, one thing was clear. This wasn't something we could come back from. The cracks in our marriage had widened into a chasm, and I wasn't sure we could ever bridge it. Jenna's late-night excursions became more frequent, and each one tightened the noose of betrayal around my neck. She continued to maintain the facade of a devoted wife, smiling at me over breakfast and chatting about trivial things as though our marriage hadn't been reduced to a shadow of its former self. I played along, biding my time, watching as she unraveled the threads of our life together. It wasn't long before patterns emerged. Her client meetings often fell on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, always at conveniently vague locations. I began to track her movements, keeping a detailed log of where she went and how long she stayed. The evidence piled up with a weight I could no longer bear. One Thursday, curiosity and anger overrode my better judgment. I decided to follow her more closely. Jenna left the house in a fitted dress I didn't recognize, her heels clicking against the pavement with a confidence that felt foreign. I trailed her car at a careful distance as she drove downtown, finally pulling into the parking lot of a small, upscale restaurant. I parked nearby, watching as she stepped out of the car and walked inside without a second glance. Minutes later, Elliot arrived. He strolled into the restaurant as if he owned the place, his easy confidence infuriatingly familiar. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I imagined the scene unfolding inside. The way they'd laugh, their hands brushing, the intimacy they shared at my expense. I waited, the minutes dragging by like hours, before finally stepping out of the car. I wasn't sure what I planned to do, storm in and confront them, or perhaps just catch a glimpse of them together. Either way, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The restaurant's windows were dimly lit, its interior shielded from prying eyes by frosted glass and flickering candlelight. I hesitated at the entrance, my heart pounding as I pushed open the door. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile. "Table for one?" she asked. I shook my head, my voice low. "No, I'm meeting someone. Just looking for them." She nodded, stepping aside. "Let me know if you need help." I scanned the room, my gaze darting from table to table until I found them. They were tucked away in a corner booth, their heads close together, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of conversation around them. Jenna's hand rested on the table, her fingers brushing Elliot's in a gesture that was maddeningly intimate. They looked like a couple, a real one, and the sight made my stomach churn. I stepped back, retreating before they could see me. My hands trembled as I left the restaurant, the air outside feeling colder and heavier than before. I sat in my car, staring at the entrance, torn between rage and despair. Confronting her now would only result in lies, half-truths meant to placate me. I needed to be smarter, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I acted. The next few weeks were a blur of surveillance and planning. I'd catch glimpses of their meetings, each one more damning than the last. They met at coffee shops, shared drinks at bars, and once spent an afternoon at a park where Jenna used to take our dog. Every detail felt like a knife to the chest, a reminder of how completely she'd slipped away from me. One evening, as I sat in the car outside another of their rendezvous spots, my phone buzzed with a text from Jenna. "Running late. Don't wait up." The audacity of it was almost laughable. I stared at the screen, my hands clenching into fists. She didn't even bother to come up with a believable excuse anymore. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. My emotions couldn't cloud my judgment. Not yet. When she came home that night, I was waiting in the living room. The lights dimmed. She walked in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, and froze when she saw me. "You're up late," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I shrugged, my expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, setting her purse down and slipping off her shoes. "It was a long meeting," she added, her tone casual. "Exhausting, really?" I watched her closely, noting the faint smudge of lipstick on her collar and the way her hair was slightly tousled. The lies were so practiced, so effortless, that it almost made me doubt myself. Almost. "I'll head up," she said, avoiding my gaze as she walked toward the stairs. I didn't stop her. Not yet. There would be a time and place for confrontation, but tonight wasn't it. I needed more than anger, I needed leverage. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. By now, my patience was frayed, and every passing day felt like a razor dragging across raw skin. The charade couldn't continue much longer. Jenna's deceit, Elliot's arrogance, and my own silence were a combustible mix waiting to ignite. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. That breaking point came on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. I'd been tracking their meetings with growing precision, timing Jenna's departures and arrivals with an obsessive attention to detail. Her excuses had grown increasingly flimsy, and her disinterest in maintaining the illusion of our marriage was palpable. That night, she left with barely a word, claiming she had a last-minute client meeting that couldn't wait. I let her go, but my instincts screamed that something was different this time. I followed her, as I often did, keeping a careful distance. She drove to the same boutique hotel where I'd first seen them together. My heart pounded as I parked a block away, the weight of my suspicions pressing down on me. This wasn't just another meeting. There was an urgency in the way she'd left the house, a nervous energy that clung to her like a shadow. Inside the hotel, I found a vantage point in the lobby, half hidden behind a column. Jenna appeared moments later, her figure unmistakable in a fitted black coat that hugged her frame. She glanced around, not nervously, but deliberately, before heading toward the elevators. Seconds later, Elliot entered, his stride confident, his expression casual. They didn't acknowledge each other directly, but their synchronized movements spoke volumes. I didn't wait for the elevator doors to close. Fueled by adrenaline and rage, I slipped into the stairwell and began climbing. My steps echoed in the enclosed space, each one a heartbeat, a countdown to confrontation. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew I couldn't stand by any longer. When I reached their floor, I paused, pressing my ear to the door that led to the hallway. It was quiet, save for the distant hum of conversation and the faint ding of another elevator. I stepped out, my shoes muffled by the plush carpet, and moved toward the room I'd seen them enter on a previous visit. 14C. The door was closed, of course, but muffled voices carried through. I couldn't make out the words, but Jenna's laugh reached me clearly, soft and familiar in a way that twisted my stomach. It was the laugh she used to share with me, the one that spoke of unguarded happiness. Now it was his. I didn't knock. I didn't even think. My hand moved to the doorknob, twisting it without hesitation. Locked. The sound startled me back to reality, and I stepped away, my chest heaving as I realized what I'd almost done. Storming in would solve nothing. It would only give them the chance to deny, to twist the narrative in their favor. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approached from behind me. I turned quickly, expecting hotel staff or even another guest, but it was neither. A man in a dark hoodie strode toward me, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the hallway. My first thought was that he was security, someone about to question my presence. But then he spoke, his voice low and sharp. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I frowned, my heart still pounding. "What are you talking about?" 14C, he said, his gaze flicking toward the door behind me. "You don't want to get involved." My confusion deepened, but before I could respond, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Grayson's not who you think he is. Walk away while you still can. And then he was gone, disappearing down the hallway as quickly as he'd appeared. I stood there, stunned, replaying his words. Who was this man? What did he know about Elliot, and why had he warned me? The questions tumbled through my mind, colliding with the anger and betrayal that had driven me here in the first place. Minutes passed before the door to 14C opened. I ducked around the corner, watching as Jenna stepped out, adjusting her coat and glancing down the hallway. Elliot followed, his expression unreadable as he placed a hand on her back, guiding her toward the elevator. I waited until they were gone before approaching the door again. It was slightly ajar, as if they'd been in too much of a rush to close it properly. My pulse raced as I pushed it open, stepping into the room they just vacated. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and faint traces of perfume. The bed was rumpled, the sheets tangled, and an empty champagne bottle sat on the table beside two glasses. But it was the folder on the desk that caught my eye. BrightSpark's logo was stamped on the cover, and inside were pages of financial documents, some of which bore my signature. I flipped through them quickly, my confusion mounting with each page. Transactions I didn't recognize, agreements I'd never approved, numbers that didn't add up. This wasn't just an affair. This was something deeper, something darker. The pieces began to fall into place, the warning from the man in the hallway echoing in my mind. Elliot wasn't just taking Jenna from me. He was stealing something far greater. I left the room, the folder tucked under my arm, and stepped into the cold night air. My mind churned with possibilities, each one more damning than the last. Whatever Elliot's endgame was, it wasn't just about my wife. And I was going to find out exactly what he was after, no matter the cost. The folder from Elliot's hotel room sat on my desk, its contents spread out like pieces of a sinister puzzle. I'd spent the entire night poring over the documents, a rising tide of anger and disbelief fueling my every breath. What I'd uncovered wasn't just a betrayal of my marriage. It was a betrayal of my trust, my business, and everything I'd built. Elliot hadn't just seduced Jenna. He'd been siphoning money from BrightSpark's accounts, using forged approvals with my signature to cover his tracks. The sums weren't small either. He was funneling cash into offshore accounts, leaving a trail that pointed directly back to me. If this came to light, I'd be the one facing scrutiny, the one who looked like a criminal. The magnitude of his scheme was staggering. He'd played me from the beginning, selling his charm and vision during his pitch, all the while setting up the perfect con. And Jenna, was she complicit, or just another pawn in his game? I couldn't answer that question yet. But one thing was clear. Elliot wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The next morning, I left for the office early, carrying the folder with me. I needed to act fast before Elliot made his next move. First, I called my lawyer, laying out what I'd discovered. "David, this is serious," she said, her voice tight with concern. "We need to move quickly to protect you. Freeze any transactions involving BrightSpark and document everything." "Already done," I said. "But there's more. I need to confront him." "Confront him? David, that's a terrible idea. Let me handle this legally." "This isn't just about the company," I interrupted, my voice rising. "He's been involved with Jenna. I need to hear it from him." A heavy silence hung between us before she finally sighed. "If you're set on this, be careful. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment." After hanging up, I set my plan in motion. Elliot had a scheduled meeting at BrightSpark's offices that afternoon. He didn't know I'd uncovered his scheme, and I intended to use that to my advantage. When he arrived, his confidence was as nauseating as ever. He strolled into the conference room, shaking hands and flashing his practice smile at my team. I let him settle in before entering the room, carrying the folder under my arm. "David," he greeted, standing to shake my hand. "Good to see you." I ignored his outstretched hand and set the folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal the damning documents. "Sit down, Elliot." The smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly, lowering himself into the chair. "What's this about?" "You tell me," I said, my voice cold. "Because it looks like you've been stealing from Bright Spark." "From me?" His expression hardened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "David, there must be some mistake." Don't insult me," I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. "I have your offshore accounts, forged signatures, every single transaction you tried to bury. Do you think I wouldn't notice?" For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. His composure cracked, and his words faltered. "David, listen. This isn't what it looks like. I can explain." "Explain what?" I demanded, leaning in. "How you used my wife to distract me while you robbed me blind. How you played us both for fools." He swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered. "Jenna, she wasn't part of this. I swear." "Don't lie to me," I growled. "You think I haven't seen the two of you together? I know exactly what's been going on." Elliot's face drained of color. For a moment, he looked like he might try to deny it, but then his shoulders sagged. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake. I got greedy. But Jenna, she didn't know about the money. She cared about me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands clenched into fists as I fought the urge to lunge across the table. "You disgust me," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You're finished. The authorities will be here soon, and when they are, you'll answer for everything." Elliot's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "David, wait. We can work this out. I can make this right." "There's no fixing this," I said coldly. "You've already lost." The room fell silent as the weight of my words settled over him. He slumped back in his chair, defeated, while I left the room, my chest heaving with adrenaline. Outside, I called security and instructed them to hold Elliot until the authorities arrived. The confrontation had ended, but the fallout was only beginning. Jenna, I'd have to face her next, and when I did, there would be no place for her to hide. The hours following Elliot's downfall were a blur of police statements, phone calls with lawyers, and damage control with Bright Spark stakeholders. By the time I returned home, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but it wasn't enough to dull the sting of what I still had to face. Jenna. She was in the living room when I walked in, curled up on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading. The tension in her posture was impossible to miss. She glanced up as I entered, her smile strained. "You're home late," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I dropped my bag by the door, my eyes fixed on her. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, and she set the book aside. "David, what's wrong?" The sheer audacity of her feigned innocence made my blood boil. "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "How about the fact that you've been lying to me? That you've been sleeping with Elliot while he's been stealing from my company?" Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for a response. "David, don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation that makes this okay. I know everything, Jenna. The meetings, the hotel rooms, the texts. All of it." She stood, her hands trembling. I didn't know about the money. I swear, David. I had no idea he was stealing from you." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar even to me. "So you're telling me it was just the affair? That makes it better." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. It got out of control. I was lonely, David. You've been so busy with work, so distant. And Elliot, he made me feel seen." "Seen?" I echoed, my voice rising. "I've been killing myself to provide for us, Jenna, to give you everything. And you repay me by running off with him?" Her tears spilled over, and she sank back onto the couch. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The anger that had been boiling inside me threatened to spill over, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. "Sorry doesn't fix this," I said, my tone colder now. "You didn't just betray me. You jeopardized everything I've worked for. My reputation, my company, everything. She looked up at me, her expression desperate. Please, David. We can work through this. We can go to counseling, fix what's broken. I shook my head, the weight of her words falling flat against the wall of my anger. There's nothing to fix. Whatever we had, you destroyed it the moment you chose him over me. Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't stay. The sight of her, the sound of her voice, all of it was too much. I turned and walked upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind me. The next few days were a blur of logistical arrangements. I moved into the guest room, avoiding Jenna whenever possible. Our conversations were reduced to terse exchanges about bills and practical matters. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, each silence more deafening than the last. Jenna tried to reach out, leaving notes on the kitchen counter, sending texts apologizing and begging for another chance. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. The betrayal was too raw, too deep. Every time I saw her, all I could think about was her and Elliot, laughing, touching, conspiring. It wasn't until a week later that I finally broached the topic of separation. We sat at the dining table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and memories, now a battleground for the remnants of our marriage. You've spoken to a lawyer, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. We need to start discussing the terms of the divorce. Jenna's face crumpled, her eyes wide with despair. David, no, please, don't do this. We can find a way to move forward. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head, my resolve unshaken. There's no moving forward, Jenna. Not after this. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she grasped mine. I love you, David. Please don't throw this away. I pulled my hand back, the ache in my chest growing unbearable. You threw it away the moment you let him into our lives. This is the consequence of your actions. Jenna, you have to live with it. And so do I. The conversation ended with more tears, more pleas, but my decision was final. The love we'd shared was now a hollow memory, overshadowed by the betrayal that had torn us apart. As I left the table, the sound of Jenna's sobs followed me, a cruel reminder of what we'd lost. The end was near, and all that remained was to sign the papers that would officially sever the ties between us. But even as I prepared for the next chapter of my life, a question lingered in my mind, refusing to be silenced. How had it come to this? The courtroom was colder than I'd expected, both in temperature and atmosphere. The air felt sterile, heavy with the muted tension of other lives being unraveled behind closed doors. Jenna sat at the far end of the long table, her eyes downcast, her face pale and drawn. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant woman I'd married, the one whose laughter once filled our home. But that woman was gone, and so was the life we'd built together. My lawyer leaned toward me, whispering final instructions about the upcoming proceedings. I nodded absently, my focus on the divorce papers that lay in front of me. The lines of legal jargon blurred as memories of the past flooded my mind. The early days of our marriage, the quiet nights spent planning our future, the small moments of joy that now felt like cruel mockeries of what could have been. Jenna's lawyer stood first, making a case for an equitable division of assets. The arguments felt perfunctory, devoid of the emotion that had defined our marriage's collapse. She'd requested a significant portion of our joint savings, citing her inability to work full-time during the marriage. My lawyer countered, pointing out her freelance income and her role in the events that had led us here. The battle played out in legalese, but beneath the formalities was a bitter struggle for closure. When Jenna finally spoke, her voice trembled. I'm not proud of what I've done, she said, her gaze fixed on the table. But I never stopped loving you, David. I just lost my way. Her words hung in the air, echoing in the hollow space between us. I wanted to believe her, to find some shred of truth in her apology. But the betrayal was a scar too deep to ignore. I didn't respond, my silence more damning than any words could be. The judge's decision came swiftly. The assets were divided. She received enough to start over, but not more than she deserved. The house, the one place that had once been a sanctuary, was awarded to me. Felt like a hollow victory. Walls and a roof were no substitute for the life that had crumbled within them. After the hearing, Jenna approached me in the corridor. The building's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on her face, accentuating the lines of stress and regret. "David," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of distant conversations. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to walk away. But something in her eyes, a glimmer of the woman I'd once loved, made me pause. "There's nothing left to say," I said, my tone firm but not unkind. "Please," she pressed. I want you to know that I'm going to fix myself. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." I studied her, searching for sincerity. For once, I believed her, but it wasn't enough. "I hope you do," I said finally, "for your sake. But I can't be part of that anymore." Her tears fell silently as she nodded, and for a fleeting moment, I almost reached out to comfort her. But the weight of everything that had happened held me back. I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weeks after the divorce were a strange mix of freedom and emptiness. I threw myself into work, channeling my energy into salvaging Bright Spark and rebuilding my reputation. The scandal surrounding Elliot's fraud had made waves, but with the right strategy and a loyal team, I was slowly regaining my footing. At home, the silence was deafening. The house felt larger, emptier, its every corner a reminder of what I'd lost. I thought about selling it, starting fresh somewhere new, but part of me couldn't let go. It was as if I needed to conquer the memories, to reclaim the space on my own terms. One evening, as I sorted through old boxes in the attic, I stumbled upon a photo album. The pages were filled with snapshots of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. There we were on our wedding day, laughing during vacations, celebrating milestones. Each image was a testament to the love we'd once shared, a love that had ultimately succumbed to time and temptation. I closed the album, setting it aside. The past was a heavy burden, but it was one I could no longer carry. The only way forward was to let it go. Months later, as spring began to thaw the winter's chill, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting my tie for yet another investor meeting. My reflection stared back at me, older, wiser, and undeniably changed. The man I'd been when I first met Jenna was gone, replaced by someone who'd weathered betrayal and loss, but come out stronger on the other side. The journey wasn't over. The scars of the past would always remain, faint reminders of a life that could have been. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that the future, uncertain as it was, still held possibilities. As I stepped out into the world, the weight of the divorce finally began to lift. The road ahead was mine to forge, and I was ready to take the first step. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.